Well, the housing crisis is actually produced by a total market failure, because English people have convinced themselves if they keep selling their homes to each other at ever higher prices, they're getting richer, which is the ultimate pathetic fallacy, because the only people getting richer are actually the moneylenders who drive the process. Now, as we are progressively exporting our manufacturing activity to low-wage areas of the world, the British economy is becoming basically a bubble of shopping funded by debt secured on ever-inflating house prices. You've probably read recently that the downturn in the American housing market is threatening a world recession. And for our economy to go on growing, it is necessary for house prices to go up and up and up. There are now alleged to be 17.4 million families in this country who can't afford houses either to buy or to rent, which is an absolute nonsense. And governments making spin-driven statements about helping more people get on the housing ladder is just idiocy, because as soon as you sell a low-cost house, it becomes a high-cost house. And no one ever talks about the fact that everyone on the housing ladder has a great millstone of debt round their neck and is standing on the fingers of someone else who hasn't got on yet.
Planners currently recognise only two affordable housing mechanisms: social rented accommodation and shared ownership accommodation. Only the top 20% of households priced out of the owner-occupier market can afford the shared ownership schemes. Many households can afford more than social rented housing, but can't afford anything else. Yet huge amounts of subsidy are channelled into social rented housing, with little thought being given to intermediate needs. The challenge for professionals is to find a way through the difficulties and to come up with workable solutions. One solution being put forward is the Community Land Trust, or CLT. A CLT is a not-for-profit, community-controlled organisation that owns, develops and manages local assets for the benefit of the local community. The aim is to obtain land and property and hold it in perpetuity for the benefit of a defined locality or community. A key feature of the CLT model is that it separates the value of the land from the properties that stand on it. This removes the effect of land appreciation and allows long-term affordable and sustainable local development. In this programme, our main focus is on the CLT's role in providing affordable housing, but there are wider applications.
When considering CLTs, you have to break them down, in my view, into two key categories. The first is what I might call a housing CLT, and the second is a public realm CLT. As far as housing CLTs are concerned, they are, at least as presently conceived, particularly suitable for a rural context, where there are pressing needs for affordable housing on relatively small scales, particularly, for example, in the West Country, where there is an acute housing shortage and very high property values. The CLT also, though, can play a part in larger scale contexts in its public realm guise. That's to say, we can see serious possibilities for introducing CLTs into new towns, into the new towns proposed for growth areas, perhaps also in urban contexts where there is a need for community assets to be held on trust in perpetuity.
Whilst different CLT models exist, the overall approach can be simplified into three steps of locking up the land, leasing to the community, and then renting or selling to the local residents. Land cost is usually the biggest component of new build housing costs. If you are able to take land costs out of the development completely, the affordability of a property would increase significantly. In this example, developing not-for-profit and allowing for land costs at 50% of full market value, a two-bedroomed property would come down to around £130,000, compared to over £200,000 in the open market.
Obviously, with most development, the portion of the development that is land value is a majority of the cost of the resulting housing. With traditional speculative for-profit development, the developer will buy the land from the landowner, do his development, and then parcel it off. And at each of those stages, the increase in land value will be crystallised, so the end occupier is paying the full amount. Whereas if we keep the land as a freehold in a pool, in a community pool, we can release that land value more slowly. We can even pay for it at a different rate than we pay for the development, because we know that it will be used for 100 years and the houses might only be used for 50 years, so we can take out different financing.
A key issue for all CLTs is where the land will come from. Some of the many sources include land which is gifted or heavily discounted by landowners interested in the long-term future of their local community. Provided through the planning system, either by Section 106 agreements or rural exception sites. Purchased at a discount from public sector landlords. And endowed for community benefit by statutory bodies.
Like any other developer, the Community Land Trust will expect to have to pay for land. Obviously, every penny that comes off the market value of land is a discount that we can pass on to the occupiers of the homes. The Country Landowners Association, for example, have done research that shows that rural landowners will tend to be amenable to giving up some of that value if they know that it's going to be preserved for the benefit of the local community. In urban areas it's slightly more difficult, because obviously land is hugely more valuable often. And there, if we get the planning authorities and so on our side with the notion that Community Land Trust can provide genuinely affordable housing, we expect maybe to do some deals with existing developers for their affordable quotient.
Once the land is acquired, the next stage is to grant a long lease to the community group established to develop that land. The lease will include the ability to grant a charge on the land to a lender, so the development organisation can borrow against the land value to finance the development. A development partnership is formed to work with the local community to design, specify and finance the development. The third and final stage is to either rent or sell the housing to the local residents. Oxfordshire CLT adopts a mutual ownership society model.
When the housing is built, it gets transferred into a specially set up company, a mutual home ownership society, and the residents have to join that. If you think of it as a huge, great corporate mortgage, where we can take advantage of cheap rates and longer terms and things like that of a corporate mortgage, then the residents pay in their share of that mortgage and get equity out the other end. And obviously, because we're aiming to produce affordable housing, we'll be expecting people to pay about 30% of their after-tax income, obviously adjusted slightly for household composition. And as time goes on, they'll be expected to top that up. So if a household leaves and another household comes in who can afford slightly less than the one that's gone, we'll expect the others to pick up extra shares.
So, a single professional, only just priced out of the ownership market, will pay more for a one-bedroom flat than a family with children, earning only just too much to qualify for help with social rented housing. But each will receive shares in proportion to what they pay in. The value of the shares is linked to a local property price index, agreed at the outset. This ensures their investment keeps pace with the local property market. The total paid into the mutual ownership society by the residents has to cover the borrowing costs for the development as well as ongoing management and maintenance costs. Each resident is expected to participate in decision-making in the society. Stonesfield is an Oxfordshire village on the edge of the Cotswolds. It's within easy reach of the M40 and is just a few miles away from railway stations with direct services to London.
In the early 80s housing boom, one-bedroom houses in this village went from about £7,750 up towards £60,000. And we could see this market rise having a narrowing effect on the age, social and economic range of the population. The role of the primary school was falling because people of childbearing age couldn't afford to live in the village any longer, and we realised that unless some affordable housing was provided pretty damn quick, we were going to end up with a much narrower village.
The Stonesfield Community Trust was created in 1983 as a charity in response to escalating rents and property prices.
The key objectives were to make it possible for the full range of population to stay in the village. Under the market, when old people from the village died, their children would of course sell on to the highest bidder, which meant that there was this narrowing effect on the population. And we wanted it to be possible to have young working families staying in the village.
Tony was instrumental in the Stonesfield Community Trust. He donated a quarter-acre site, whilst a local company provided £3,000 in funding to cover setting up costs, legal fees, and a planning application for a scheme of 4 houses.
Once we'd got planning permission on the site, which had originally cost peanuts, it was worth £150,000. So we took that to the bank and said, look, collateral, lend us some money to start building. We bought a limited company off the shelf to carry out the development ourselves on a direct build basis, thereby saving the 28% profit that a builder would make. And we registered the company for VAT, so we recovered £14,000 worth of VAT on our building materials. And by a lot of very hard work, including work done at concessionary rates by local tradesmen who supported us, we managed to get the first 2 houses built.
Shortly after completion of the first 2 homes, additional funding was secured, enabling a total of 6 dwellings to be completed. This track record allowed them to secure a second site in 1993, on which a further 5 houses were completed with funding from a range of sources. The second site also provides community facilities, including workspaces, which currently house a preschool nursery and the village post office. So Stonesfield Community Trust has provided 14 affordable dwellings, addressing the needs of local people who are employed but on modest incomes, people who don't qualify for subsidised housing but can simply not afford to live in the area on an average working wage. Stonesfield is proof of what can be achieved when a proactive community thinks creatively about finance. The key elements of community engagement, affordable housing and a sustainable community show that CLTs are in a strong position to deliver the core government objective of sustainable development.
The political context is extremely favourable for CLTs at the moment. Indeed, you could say that the CLT's time has come. The government, through Gordon Brown and Ruth Kelly and others, earlier with David Miliband, have been saying that community ownership is the route to follow for many of the controversial developments which the country is facing and having to accept, if you will, to accommodate growth in population and indeed shifts in population. So community ownership is certainly the way forward for DCLG, the government's department.
The political will may well be favourable, yet CLTs have been slow to take root.
I think the biggest block that we have is actually getting across to planners, in particular local authority planners, that what we offer is affordable housing. There is a mismatch between what the Department of Communities and Local Government term affordable housing and what many local authorities, particularly in areas of high housing need, are able to count. And most of them will only include social rented housing with perhaps a small amount of the housing association shared ownership type tenure. So if we can persuade them that we actually offer genuinely affordable housing that meets the criterion of the government departments and so on, then I think then we'll be able to do deals with developers because they'll have some confidence that their affordable quotient is what will be expected by a local authority. Obviously, at the moment, in some areas of high housing need, local authorities are getting so little land coming through that they have to focus on what their housing departments call priority need. And the Community Land Trust model really aims at a market slightly above that, households that aren't poor enough to justify the full subsidy of social rented housing, but are still priced out of the mainstream owner-occupancy market. But what they've got to realise, of course, is that by addressing only that very low-level need for, if you like, welfare housing, they're still leaving a huge gap in the market. The first-time buyer that can't reach the ladder is not the same person who's likely to want to be in a council house for the rest of his time. And if they can use community land trusts to address that intermediate market need, then they will actually be freeing up space in their existing target rent level stock.
Local authorities are not the only obstacles slowing the adoption of CLTs. Indeed, developers have been wary to jump in.
The commercial property developers, I think it's fair to say, have not approached the CLT concept with enthusiasm, but it's also fair to say that they haven't been presented with a model and a product properly to evaluate. The commercial property developers and their surveyor advisors want to have something very real on the table. Why, therefore, are they looking at this perhaps a little askance or with a little bit of concern? Well, it's almost certainly because they simply don't know how, particularly in a housing context, purchasers are going to react to the model. The model will involve a leasehold rather than a freehold interest being offered to the purchaser. From a purely legal and theoretical point of view, that is as good as and shouldn't detract from the product that's being offered. On the other hand, commercial property developers will be saying to themselves, when I have a choice between a site down the road where I can offer a freehold to that purchaser and this CLT site where I can only offer a leasehold unit or product, then perhaps I'll go for the former, not the latter.
It's widely recognised that CLTs require commitment and can be complex to set up. So, from the developer's perspective, the question arises, why do it?
When a developer gets his planning permission and has to produce affordable housing, obviously they've got to do what the local authority says and meet the needs in the local plan. And at the moment, community land trusts aren't recognised particularly as a way of providing the same sort of affordable housing. However, if we do get that recognition, developers, I think, will want to work with community land trusts because of the mix of income households that will occupy them. They will be able to keep the value up in their for-profit bit of the development because they'll have a genuine mixed community. They won't have 40% here of social rented housing and 60% of for-profit £400,000 executive homes. They will have a genuine mix.
Apart from simply community ownership, community involvement being, for some people at any rate, simply a good thing, there are some practical reasons for introducing a CLT. For example, a local authority might well have introduced the concept of community ownership into its development framework, and, if you like, into its planning regime. In other words, a commercial property developer might want to adopt a CLT structure for the simple reason that this unlocks planning permission for sites which might not otherwise be accessible. It also offers the prospect of long-term buy-in by the local community. At the very outset, they may not simply stand by or indeed oppose a planning application. They may actually support it, endorse it and promote it with the local authority. So in other words, again, we might see a planning development happening which might not otherwise happen. And then secondly, once that development is up and running, if you will, it offers the prospect for maintaining that development in its initial format, concept, and making sure that that community that it serves is a sustainable one. In other words, it continues to have local community buy-in.
Oxfordshire Community Land Trust was formed from the recognition there was little government subsidy available for affordable housing in the area. But with a lack of real examples on the ground, what is needed to encourage their growth?
There's a pressing need for exchanging information on the CLT concept. There is a CLT forum, of which I'm a member, convened initially by the Building and Social Housing Foundation. We need to take that initiative further forward. We need to establish formal or at least informal links between those who are practitioners in this area so we can share good practice one with another. There's also a need for a directory of CLTs, of community land trusts, so that the people can get in touch with one another and see how they work. And we also need now to drill down from, as it were, the concept to the detail. A toolkit, a CLT toolkit is in prospect and badly needed. And we need practitioners, lawyers, surveyors and others who have done it on the ground and know how it works. And then that confidence, that technical expertise can be shared, particularly with the commercial property market, to give them confidence that this is something seriously to explore.
Given the availability of shared best practice coupled with a favourable political environment, how long will it be before CLTs become mainstream, and in what capacity might they flourish?
The adoption of the CLT model will certainly, in my view, take two forms. The first is in the housing context, what I'm calling the housing CLT. I think it definitely will be adopted for smallish scale rural developments, particularly perhaps in the West Country and its similar market circumstances. In other words, where there are communities that have got the appetite, the determination to see a CLT concept through from start to finish, where they've got the time and the energy to see it through. It will also, in my view, be adopted in certain new town contexts, in certain growth areas where there's a pressing need for providing for common assets to be held in trust for the community in the long term. Will it go further than that? Will it be adopted as a mainstream concept, a mainstream model, if you will? The jury's out on that. Much will turn on the success of those housing CLTs in the West Country, and as far as public realm assets are concerned, we'll have to see how they play in the new town growth areas.
I think in an era where subsidy is likely to remain low, community land trusts have got a big part to play by using the value of land under our feet to effectively subsidise affordable property assets. But there are other areas which I think are more exciting. For example, there's a version of the community land trust model which is being used in a number of places now to deal with stock transfer, where the council housing estate becomes, if you like, owned by the tenants as a community land trust type thing. And also we have this huge amount of urban housing in Britain, if you like, the belts of urban pebble dash, which were built between the wars and shortly after the wars, which are now reaching the end of their lives, and communities themselves are feeling very put upon when the small developer comes and buys up a corner plot and wants to put 6 flats where there was a single semi-detached house. And we think that community land trust can be used as a mechanism for those sorts of local communities to club together and take control of their own futures.